Alright, this time we're going to explain this Overtones series in terms of an open tubing. Now, by the way, if you go to football games, sometimes you'll see people with these rubber tubes, and when they swing the rubber tube over their head, it makes a humming. The first note you usually get out of one of those tubes happens to be the fifth. It's not very good at supporting the root because you're not moving the whole tube. You're usually just holding one end of it and getting part of the tube. So the first note you usually hear on those things is the note 5. If you spin them faster, it'll go da, da. Then you spin it a little faster, it'll go da, and a little faster, da, and you can get da, 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 which are the first 4 notes, 5, 1, 3, 5, 3, 1, 5. With those 5 notes are notes that can play songs like So with those 4 notes on one of those tubes, you can actually play taps, or you can play reveille, or any song you've ever heard on a bugle. If I take this tube and I bend the tubing, it doesn't matter. If I put a big bell on one end of the tube, and then wrap the tube around, and then come back around again, and then come out here to some mouthpiece, let's say, where I'm blowing into this tube. It doesn't matter if I unwrap this tube, the length from this point to this open point becomes the length of the tubing, and that length determines the frequency at which it can vibrate naturally, and then it sets up on top of that all of these overtones series. So any hollow tube spun through the air will produce these overtone series. The faster you spin it, the higher in pitch it goes. The slower you spin it, the lower it goes. If you can hold it at arm's length and give it a real slow spin, you can even on those plastic tubes get them to go down to the root. But they don't like to stay there for too long. They like to pop up here. It's more stable. Here's a good example. This thing is a trombone. Now a trombone is just simply, you can see here, this is the one end of the tubing. It comes down, comes up here, goes around, and here's the open end of the tubing. And if I were to take this and stretch this out, it would be almost about 12 to 14 feet in length. And that 12 to 14 feet in length happens to be tuned to B flat on the piano, which is why it's called a B flat trombone. Now if it were an F trombone, it would be tuned to F. If it were a C trombone, it would be tuned to C. As far as I know, they don't make those. The most common trombone is the B flat trombone. A more complicated form of tubing, where there's even more coils in it than that, would be something like a trumpet. Now it turns out the trumpet is also tuned to B flat. If you took this trombone and stretched it out, let's say it's 14 feet, you open this up and stretch it out from its mouthpiece to its trumpet end, its bell, it would be exactly half that, 7 feet. So this is 14 feet, this is 7 feet long. This is a low B flat, this is a higher B flat. These two instruments are exactly 1 octave apart, but their open tunings are both tuned to the open note B flat. Now I know a lot of teachers teach people C, and the reason they teach that the open tuning is C is because they're trying to teach you how to read on the staff in the key of C, which is the easiest key on the staff to read. But they're actually lying to you, because the sound that you're producing in terms of cycles per second, the sound that's being produced on a meter, a tuning meter, would be B flat. So the first note that this horn wants to support on the open tuning would be, and if I turn my meter on here, my meter will tell me you'll see it's B flat. So I'm producing a B flat. Now if I vibrate my lips a little bit higher in pitch, what will happen is the next point that the horn will support will be the musical fifth. So I go twinkle, twinkle. So now the musical fifth is ringing out. If I tighten my lips so they vibrate at twice the frequency, they'll go here, here, and then here. So now the open lip vibration is finding the most mechanical advantage at these nodal points along the overtone series, and the instrument is producing those notes. If I go higher, according to this overtone theory we studied earlier, the notes get closer together. And this is the first octave above the reference point. The second octave above, it should produce the 3 and the 5 as well in open tuning. So if I'm down here, that's why we can play all these bugle tunes like taps and stuff like that. These are where the mechanical advantage of the air going through the tube are, and because of the overtones of the natural tuning of the tube, which in this case is B flat. Now let's look at these in terms of musical names. Since the open tuning on the trombone, and I will only be talking not in terms of the scripted language that you've learned, I'll be talking in terms of concert pitch here, okay? Or the actual number of cycles per second this is going. This is going about 60 some odd cycles per second. It turns out that B flat is almost exactly 60 cycles per second. It's the same as the humming, all this humming you're hearing around you. All the transformers in the world on their telephone poles, electricity moves back and forth 60 times a second. So it's producing, electricity is producing the B flat. So this is B flat. The fifth up from that is the note F. And then the next octave above that would be again a B flat key. If we go higher, the third above B flat turns out to be the note D in music. The fifth above that is F, so we're getting another octave of the fifth. And then what happens is we get here a flat A. A flat A. That's seventh overtone. And then, of course, the next octave above that again is a flat B. So I can produce all of these notes, B flat, F, B flat, D, F, A flat, and B flat off of an open horn. And you see, over a 2-octave range, I can produce 1, 3, 5, 7 flat as open tones. And then down in this end, I can only produce 1, 5, and 1. So we have a lot of open space here, where here, the space here is a little bit smaller. Here it's even smaller. Here it's about the same size as here. And then right here, they're almost next door neighbors. The same would be true for the trumpet. So in the last segment we learned that the trombone is in the key of B flat, and with my limited playing skills I showed you that with open tunings and without moving anything or lengthening, changing the length of the tube, I could play the note F above that, which is the fifth of the instrument. I can then play the octave above that by vibrating my lips twice as fast. By vibrating my lips just a little bit faster, I get the next open position, which would be D, or the third on the horn. The next open position, another 5 or fifth, or F in this case. The next one, an A flat, and the next one, a B flat. Now in the case of the trumpet happens to also be in the key of B flat. But as I said earlier, if the trombone is 14 feet long, this is 7 feet long. So this actually starts here an octave higher here. And what happens is the first note it can produce, of course, is a 1, which is a B flat. Then the next tone that it can produce, it cannot produce this note. It's just like here, it has this big gap, and the next note that it can produce is this F here, where the fifth is. And then it can produce a note, B flat, up here, on where that B flat is at, and this part of it is the same as the lower octave here. Then the next octave above on the trumpet, of course, we would then get here the third, the fifth, the flat seventh, and then the 1. So we would get here then, from the B flat, we would get D, we would get F, we would get flat A, and then we would get another B flat. So again, the trumpet exhibits the exact same physics here, except since it's half the length, the pitch is doubled, and this whole same overtone series happens. So on the trumpet, instead of down here, the first note would be here in the second. Instead of the first octave, it would be. Then I go up a fifth, up an octave. You see, I'm not much of a trumpet player. My lips are too tight to do this right now, but I'm getting the same overtone series. I'm getting the B flat, then the F, then the B flat, D, F, E flat, way up there on the high 1. I'll actually get a trumpet player who plays to demonstrate this for you with a clearer tone, and the same with a trombone player, possibly, and we'll cut it in. So what happens is, even though this is starting at a higher octave, this same process happens. The natural place for the vibration of the string would be an octave higher, starting here on B in the octave 2, B2, where on the trombone it's down here on B1. And then the first overtone series, or next lip position, would be on this F here, up here in the third octave. And then the next note is the B flat in the third octave. Then we have the D in the fourth octave, the F in the fourth octave, and the A flat in the fourth octave, and then B flat in the fourth octave. And that becomes the practical range for the trumpet, where from here to here would be the practical range for the trombone. So we can now cover with these two instruments this much room with a good average player. Now the next thing about this whole process is, what are the valves for? Now what the valves do is this. On the trombone, it's simple mathematics. If I lower this thing by about 3.5 or 3 3/4 inches, I have now, you can see, actually lengthened the tube. And that makes it go down in pitch. So it would go from this B flat down in pitch. And if I move it down this much, which is about, you'll see here there's a collar. If it's down about that much collar, they call that the first position, giving us the 3.5 inches. Then I can move from the closed position, first position, I can now move to a point here, and where this collar is now where that used to be, and that would be the second position. And then in the third position, we'd be just in front of the bell, near the bell, or just in front of the bell, and you would see this is 1, 2, 3, see, 3 collar lengths, approximately. So this gives us a half step, or what we call a semitone, going from a black note down to this white note here. Then moving down like that, we're lengthening the tube, going down, lengthening the tube, lengthening the tube. Now if we take this collar and have it just in front of the bell, and you can see how starting so on and so forth. So you can see that with the trombone I'm actually lengthening. And again, I'm doing this in a straight line. Straight line. Every one of these is approximately the same distance. Closed position, first position, second position is twice as far, third position 3 times, fourth position 4 times, 5 position 5 times, sixth position 6 times, and down here to the very end here where you can see the turning on the inner tube is coming up. Right there on the very edge is the 7th position. So I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 possible positions on this horn, which would give me or correspond to this scale moving down in semitones, or what we sometimes call half steps, or chromatic tones, 1 half step per position. Now, on the trumpet, it's not as obvious, but what is happening here is instead of using the actual length of the tubing, as we're doing here, which makes it obvious, we're actually changing these little valves here. Take the air coming in through this tubing here, goes into this valve, and then the air is redirected to go through this little piece of tubing, and then come back out on this end, and come out to the bell. So what happens is when I'm pushing down this middle valve, for instance, I'm actually adding this piece of tubing to the trumpet, therefore making the trumpet longer. When I'm pushing on this first valve, which is the one closest to the mouthpiece, we call the first valve because the trumpeter's looking at it with his first finger. First finger. When I'm doing that, I'm actually lengthening the tube by this much tubing. And you can see that this tubing happens to be exactly twice the size of this piece of tubing. So this piece of tubing represents 1 chromatic tone, or 1 semitone, on the piano, and is moving me down by lengthening the horn. The first valve in the first position is lengthening the horn by 2 semitones, taking me down 2 semitones. The third valve here is 3 times the size of this one, and if I added these two together at the same time, pushed valve 2 and valve 1, that would be the same as 1 plus 2, or 3, which is the same length as pushing the third valve on its own, which is 3 lengths. So I actually have my first alternate fingering. I can go 3 half steps or semitone, 3 half steps. Then I can add another half step, or change it from adding 1 more to adding 2. Change it from adding 2 to adding a third. So now 3 plus 1 plus 2 is 6. And I have position 1, position 2, position 3, position 4, position 5, position 6. I have 6 positions, or 6 different length trumpets here, just as I have 6 different lengths on the tubing for the trombone. And that gives me 6 possible chromatic steps by lengthening the horn. So the horn only has flats. There are no sharps on the horn. I can only make it longer. Okay, so now we were talking about, in the last segment, the trombone, and we were showing how the tube gets longer to lower the pitch. And then I was talking about the valves on the trumpet. How this first valve on the trumpet is, let's say, a length of 1. Then this is a length of 2. And then this pipe down here on the third valve is a length of 3. And so what happens if you add them together, if I hold this one plus that one, I have a length of 3. which would be the same as holding this one by itself. If I hold this one, which is a length of 3, and add in this valve here, the second valve, which adds this, now we've got 3 plus 1 is 4. And if I were to do the first valve and the third valve, now I've got 3 plus 2, which is 5 in length. And then if I hold them all down, I've got 3 plus 1 plus 2, which is 6. This is the equivalent of having 6 horns at 6 different lengths tied together through the valve system. So another way of demonstrating this would be this drawing I have on the board. If we imagined that this is the trumpet, and from here to here, let's say, is however many feet is needed to produce a B-flat note with open or no lipping. That's what's happening here. Then what happens is when we use, then I'm going to write it down here as the second valve, VL. When we use the second valve, what happens is we are adding a little piece of tubing in here, the length of the difference. So it's as if I've just taken and put a piece of tubing on here. I've broken this horn here, moved it apart, and wired in a little piece of tubing here about this wide. And this little piece of tubing happens to be one chromatic tone, or what we call one semitone. It happens to be on the piano, going from a black key to a white key to a black key to a white key to a black key to a white key, or to this next white key that doesn't have a black key. There, chromatic tone, chromatic tone, chromatic, chromatic. And so I have now lengthened the tubing by one chromatic tone, or one semitone. Now, if I were to hold down the first valve by itself, valve number 1, I am now lengthening this piece by 2 pieces of tubing now, 1 plus 1, which equals 2 pieces of tubing. So this is 2 semitones longer, or goes down in pitch. If I push down the third valve by itself, I am now lengthening this piece of tubing by 3. 1, 2, 3, which equals 3 semitones. And each time I add a valve, I'm essentially just creating a new trumpet that's a little bit longer. We'll see how this applies in just a bit. So here I have an alternate. I can hold the third valve down, which is 3 pieces of tubing long, or I can hold the first valve, which is 2 pieces of tubing, and the second valve, which is 1 piece of tubing, and 1 plus 2 equals 3. So these guys could be held together. So I have an alternate valve pattern here in which I could use valves 1 and valves 2 together to produce the same length of tubing as I do with just the third valve by itself. Now, there's a reason for this later. You'll see that essentially all I need to play a diatonic scale is these 2 valves. And with 2 valves I can play do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But if I want the full chromatic scale filled in and to create lots of alternate fingerings, I'm going to have to use this or this alternately. So now what happens is, if I hold down here the third valve plus the second valve here, 3 plus 2 together, I now have a piece of tubing that's 1, 2, 3, 4 in length. The third valve is 3, the second valve is 1, so now this equals 4 semitones longer. And in the next one, here, if I hold down the third valve plus the first valve, then what I'm getting is 2 pieces of tubing plus 3 lengths of tubing, which gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lengths of tubing. So now this horn is 5 semitones longer. And if I add the last and final valve, I hold down the third valve, which equals 3. I hold down the second valve, which equals 1. And I hold down the first valve, which equals 2. I now have 2 plus 1 plus 3, which equals 6. or I have 6 semitones. Open, B flat. Next one valve, we're a half step lower. Next valve, half step lower. Next valve, half step lower, half step lower, half step lower, half step lower. It's as if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different horns. 7 different lengths. We can also postulate. If this is B flat, then a half step down from B flat means that this horn with the second valve is producing the note A. So this is an A horn. If we go down to the next horn, it's producing another note a little lower, so this is a flat A or a sharp G. So that horn could be either an A flat horn or a sharp G'd horn. If we go down to the next horn with three valves, combinations of 3, we now have G. If we go down one more half step, we now have flat G or sharp F. And if we move down to the next step, we now have the note F. So now we have a horn in F. And if we go down again, we now have a horn in E. So it's as if I have a B flat horn, an A horn with the second valve, an A flat G sharp horn with the first valve, a G horn with the first and second or the third, a G flat F sharp horn using these two fingers, the third and the second, an F horn if I'm using the third valve and the first valve, and an E horn if I'm using all 3 of these horns. So we have 7 different lengths, 7 different horns. Okay? The next part of this, I'm going to show how the Overtone series mapped into each and every one of these horns, or on each valve, will produce the 7 notes in the Overtone series that we can get off of an open tuning. So there should be 7 notes for each of these fingering or valve positions. Next. Okay, welcome back. Now what we're going to do is we were talking about every time I push a valve here, like when I push the second valve, the valve is being measured from the mouthpiece. That's valve 1, valve 2, and valve 3. So when I'm pushing valve 2, I'm adding in 1 semitone, and I'm making the horn longer and it's dropping down. And it now goes from being a B flat horn to an A open horn. And if I push the first valve, I'm now doubling the length of that tubing. I'm going down 2 semitones, and now I have all the same properties as an A flat or G sharp open horn. If I hold these 2 valves here, I have 2 plus 1, which is 3, and I'm now in the key of G. And I have a G horn with all of the overtones based on that horn. Likewise, if I hold the third valve on its own, this one piece of tubing is the equivalent to these 2 pieces of tubing. And what happens now is I'm still getting a G on the horn, and I still have the entire Overtone series available for me on that horn. Now what we learned earlier about the Overtone series is for any open tubing, there are 7 lip positions that will give me the 7 tones. We went 1, and then we went from the B flat to the F, to the B flat, to the D, to the F, to the A flat, to the... So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 separate lip positions. And if I hold this lip position here on F and push a valve, I'm lengthening the horn. And if I hold this and push the first valve, I'm lengthening it by 2 half steps. If I hold that position, my lip position, and hit 3 valves, the third valve I'm going down that, or the first and second valve I'm going down that amount. Hit this, hit valve 3 and 2, I'm going down 4 half steps, 5 half steps, 6 half steps, and then to the next open note again. So what happens is, look at it this way. On the B flat horn, I have here a root, a fifth, and a root, then a third, a fifth, a flat 7, and then another root again. And if I were to translate that, this would be, of course, B flat. Then this note here becomes F. This is a B flat. This note here becomes a D. That note there is an F. This note here is a flat A. And then this note, of course, is a high B flat. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes for the 7 different lip positions to that open horn. Now when I push the first valve, the second valve in this case, which gives me a semitone, lengthening the horn, I now have here the note A, which is 1. The fifth here of A, this fifth, would now produce a new note, E. And what happens is, again, we have now another A on this horn. And then the third here is a sharp C. The fifth on this horn here would be an E. The flat 7 on this horn would be a G. And then the root again is A. So on this horn here, with the second valve down, I can produce the notes A, E, A, C sharp, E, G, and A. Now when I hold the first valve down by itself, I've lengthened the horn by 2 semitones, made it an A flat, G sharp horn. It could be either of these, which is the 1, but the 5 of that horn now becomes flat E. Again, I'm going to say A flat. Then this note here, the third, becomes C. The fifth becomes another E flat. The 7 flat now is a flat G and a flat A. Flat A, flat G, flat E. Instead of C sharp, a C. Flat A. Instead of an E, we have an E flat, and instead of an A flat, you see. And of course the same spelling for as if it were G sharp. Then, if I hold down the third valve by itself, I've lengthened the horn by 3 semitones, and now I have a G horn. And the root here is going to be G. The fifth here, under this G, is going to wind up being D. The root again will be another G. Then we will have up here a B for my third, will be a B. My fifth will be the F, will be a B, F, and then G, and this should be a G flat becomes an F. Sorry, the E flat becomes a D. I left out the D. Okay, G, D, G, D, B, F, G. Now what happens is, on the next horn, we'd have the 1, the 5, the 1, the 3, the 5, the flat 7, and the 1 again. So now we have G flat, D flat, and again, G flat. The third now is B flat. The fifth is, of course, D flat. Then we have F flat, which is the same as E. They have the same name. And then flat G. And I would spell it F flat. So G flat, D flat, G flat, B flat, D flat, F flat, G flat. On this horn, if I'm holding the third valve and the first valve, it's now a horn in F, and its open tuning is going to be C, and then F, then the third will be an A, the fifth will be another C, then the 7 overtone will be a flat E, and then we will have F, and then what happens is, if we push all these down, we now have the same pattern happening on open E. So we have open E, and here we have open E. This becomes G flat. This A becomes A flat. Up here, this this G here becomes a flat G. This E flat becomes a D, and this F becomes a E. So now what we have is 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. With the 6 valve patterns plus the open horn, we have 7 times 7 notes, which equal 49 possible notes. Now you'll notice that in some cases we have here a G, and there a G, and here a G, and everywhere a G. There are some cases where we have 1, 2, 3 possible Gs. Well, there would be 1, 2, 3 possible fingerings for that same note. In some cases we only have an F here, and then up here an F. So we only have 2 Fs. So there are 2 possible fingerings for that note. It turns out there are only 26 notes, roughly, on the trumpet, but there are 49 possibilities. So that means that there are 23, count them, 23 alternate fingerings. Some of those fingerings, one note will have 3 fingerings. In some cases, one note will have 2 fingerings. And in the lower end of the horn, some will only have a single fingering. So this is the story of the horn. We have 7 horns that represent the 6 positions of the valve plus the open. Each one can have this. Now, by the way, these lip positions here are the same for all these horns. When I'm holding and creating whatever pressure I need to create this 5th on the horn, this is just adding a valve in, so my lips are still buzzing this note. And here, these 2 valves are bringing in that note, but my lips are still buzzing this note. So with my lips buzzing this note, I can produce that note, that note, that note, that note, that note, that note with the valve patterns. I have 6 possible notes that I can produce off of one open tuning for my lips. In other words, I'm flatting everything on the horn by making it longer. There is no shortening the horn. It's all about adding length. That should do. In the last segment, we were talking about the open horn has 7 lip positions, and those 7 lip positions correspond, literally, your lips are vibrating based on these interval patterns here. So when you're going from this octave to that, your lips are actually vibrating twice as much. And when you're going from this octave up to that one, your lips are now vibrating twice as much again. The ratio between the 1 and the 5 here happens to be 3 times, so your lips are vibrating 3 times. Here your lips are vibrating, you have 5 times, 6 times, and 7 times, literally. So whatever your lips, whatever your lips are vibrating here, you can cut that in half, take that number, multiply it by 3, because there's an octave below this, don't forget, a whole octave here. You can cut that and you can figure out exactly how many cycles per second your lips are vibrating in each position. But these positions, because they're part of the Overtone series, are mechanically the easiest place to blow. They're what are called nodal points. And so if you practice just these open tones, you can learn to play across the 2 octaves of the trumpet quite nicely. As we add valves, we're adding length. So all horns work on an additive process where we're adding length. You'll see when we talk about woodwinds, we'll be doing the exact same thing with an Overtone series in a little bit shorter form. And you'll notice that it's actually subtractive. What we're doing is we have the pipe is at its maximum length, and as we're picking up fingers, we're letting the pipe leak as if we're cutting it short. So we have a soda straw, and as I buzz on the soda straw and cut it, it goes higher and higher and higher in pitch. So woodwinds use a subtractive process, but here on the horns we're always adding tubing, adding, so it's an additive process. So we're always flattening things. Now, I've taken that thing that I put together last time off the top of my head, and it turned out when I looked at it there were a lot of mistakes that I made, a lot of spelling errors, and a lot of them were enharmonic spelling errors. And then I also noticed that sometimes I would write down the correct thing and say the wrong thing, or I would say the right thing and write down the wrong thing. So I've regenerated this chart, and I want you to take a good close look at it. What happens is these represent the 7 different horns. If the horn is open, it's got these 7 lip positions. If I'm using the second valve on the horn, which only adds 1 semitone, I'm now move the whole horn down in a half a step, and now I still have these 7 lip positions, let's call them, 7 lip positions. If I add the first valve down by itself, it represents 2 semitones lower than the open horn. So everything's gone down a whole step, we call that. And what happens now is these spellings here represent the positions of the lips, again, along that horn, as if it were an independent horn. Same thing for the third valve. And it turns out the third valve and adding valves 1 and 2 together produces 1 semitone plus 2 semitones, or 3 semitones, which this line represents. And then what you have is essentially an open G horn here. By adding the third valve to the second valve, this has a unit of 3, this is a unit of 2, so that equals, unit of 3 and a unit of 1, so that equals 4 semitones. And now all these things have been flattened a half a step. We take those and flatten them again and change some of the spellings. We now have valve 3, which is a unit of 3, valve 1, which is a unit of 2, that's 5, gives us 5 semitones, and now we have essentially a horn in F with the same 7 lip positions. Now naturally, down here, these lip positions are going to be more comfortable to play for an amateur like myself who plays about once every 10 years. When I want to sit down and start to get the trumpet into shape very quickly, what I'll do is I'll practice about 10 minutes, 15 minutes every day, and then build that practice up to a half an hour, and then build that practice up to 45 minutes. And when I get up to where I'm playing trumpet, let's say 1 hour a day, every day, after about 3 months, I can get my lip back in shape enough that I can cover this whole range and all these notes. And what I do is, instead of trying the open horn, which is actually up here, the higher and tighter lip positions, which require more endurance, I practice on the valves. I close up all the valves so it's 6 half steps, or now is a half an octave below, which means that this note here, this B flat, when I bring it all the way down to this low E, that same lip position is going to relax, 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 and then down here it's not going to require as much pressure and not going to require as much breath to actually produce that note. So I can do a lot of my open tone exercises and my arpeggio exercises down here and play in lower keys and still get 2 octaves. And then as my lip gets better, I can move up to a higher position using fewer half steps, and then up until finally work my way up to being able to play these 7 lip positions on the open horn, which up here now you're going way up into the stratosphere on the piano there. So I've listed them out. These are all listed in concert pitch. So this is what you would actually read on a digital meter. Now, the last few segments, I mistook what octave the trumpet was in. I said it was down here in the second B octave, when it actually starts on the third octave, B, which is the one below middle C. So here's middle C, and then the B flat below that middle C, that's the first note on the open trumpet. The third octave, B flat. And part of the reason I said that is, if you look at the video, you'll see that it was saying BAT, and I didn't know what it said. But BAT means battery, and it was low on battery, so it wasn't reading right. So place the battery in, and now all of a sudden, oops, we're up in the third octave, and this is where the trumpet starts. So again, we have the B flat, the fifth above that becomes the F, the fourth above that now is the other octave, the third above that is D, the fifth above this B flat, an octave and a fifth, now gives us the F, and then the A flat is up 2 octaves, and then of course all of those are lip positions, and that's way too high. If you want to learn to play the trumpet, the thing to do is by using these valves we can move down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 half steps and do that same process down here where the lip positions are not as intense, and instead of this being our lowest note, we can now make one of these notes down here our lowest note. I like to actually start beginners out in G and teach them to play G to G. So when I'm training trumpet players, particularly beginner trumpet players, I will start them out on what they think, or what people call the A scale, which is actually concert pitch G, and getting them to play from G to G. Their lip doesn't have to go up that high or get that tight. Even getting the first octave for a beginner in the open tuning is difficult. So by moving it down here to the G, starting on the third valve, we can do all the stuff we want with valves 1 and 2 here and combinations, and just hold that as if it was a slightly longer horn. And then we can learn some other fingering patterns, and then learn to play in the key of G and start reading music, and they can do some embouchure tone building at that point. Next segment.
Okay.
So in this session, let's just go down each line and see. When the horn is open, we have B flat, F, and B flat, which are our 1-5-1 relationships. When there's the second valve, it's A, E, A. When it's the first valve, A flat, E flat, A flat. The third valve, or the first and second valve, G, D, G. The third valve with the second valve, which is 4 semitones, G flat, D flat, G flat. The third valve, which is 3 semitones, and the first valve 2 semitones, making 5, F, C, F, and all of the valves E, B, E. Now that's just the 1-5-1, and that's enough to learn things like the circle of fifths, and that's enough to understand simple harmonic relationships of 1 to 5. Up here we now have the spellings of our major chords going up to this, and adding that, the dominant chord. So now on the open tunings you can get B flat, D, F, which is a major chord, and add the A flat, which is one whole step below the B flat, which is our flatted 7th, to turn this into a dominant chord. On the second valve, which is only 1 semitone, we get A, C sharp, E, and the G is the 7 flat. You can see again it's a whole step below A, which is where 7 flat would be. So the major chord is A, C sharp, E, A, and then adding the G, we get the dominant chord. Here we have off of the first valve, which is 2 semitones, the A flat, C, E flat, A flat, C, E flat, and then its 7th is G flat. So again, there's your major chord, and there is your dominant chord. Off of the third valve and the second valve here, we get G flat, D flat, G flat, and then G flat, B flat, D flat, and F flat. And the reason we're spelling this F flat and not E, okay, is because it must be a whole step below the G flat to F flat. And the letter name G has to go back 1 to F. I can't skip over the letter name F and go to E for my own personal convenience. I might do that in my head, but can't do that with the spelling. And that's where some of the goof-ups I made in the last couple segments. So here again, we have this G flat major chord, G flat, B flat, D flat, and then the F flat. Here's F, there's F flat, F down to the flat. So I have to call that F flat because it has to be the seventh, the flatted seventh of the spelling. When I have the third valve and the first valve, we are now 5 semitones down, and besides the 1-5-1, we have F, A, C, and then an E flat. F, A, C, E flat, F. There's your major chord, and your dominant chord, again with the E flat being below, the whole step below. And then when I have all of them down, it's E, D, E, but now we have E, G sharp, B, and then to add it dominant, the D. So we have in here the major spellings for all the major chords and the spellings for all of the dominant chords. And we're also following this rule that below the 1, a whole step should be the 7 flat. Below this A, a whole step is G. Below this G, a whole step is F. Below this F, a whole step is E flat. And that's how we get the correct spellings. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice that there are, as I said 2 segments ago, 49 possibilities. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 7 lip positions on each of the valves, giving us a total of 49. And yet a good player who's been playing for a few years and plays in a band or an orchestra should be able to play 26 good notes. 24 would be 12 plus 12, which equals 2 octaves, and then a couple extra notes beyond that. So if you can play from this B to that B, up to this B, up to C, the high C that Maynard Ferguson has made so famous, that B to that high C, you've got a really, really good working range. However, you get these people with amazing lips who can also play down low on tones, and they can get a total of about 32 notes. Well, you can still see, even if you're the most ardent professional, there's room left over for a lot of alternatives here. And there are cases, for instance, up here we may have a D, which is on the open fingering here, where I'm lipping the third, but further on down here I can find the D here and here as well. So I can find these Ds in other places, and then further down here I can also, in the 7th flat here, find a D. So I have several fingering possibilities for that one note, D. So all of these are essentially the same D. So I can play it open, I can play it with just the third valve, or valves 1 and 2, and I can play it with all the valves. I have 4 possibilities for this single note. So we have alternatives. Now what I'm going to show you in this next segment is, let's look at this in a linear manner, the way we look at the scale here, and let's see what, obviously there are some spots when we get up here higher up where the lip positions are closer together. These 5 chromatic tones that we can play here, these 6 fingering patterns, allow us to have overlap between notes that could be played on the open horn and notes that are being fingered with my lip in a different position. So we'll examine that. In this segment, what I'm going to do is show you first what I call the microchromatic scale. This fingering pattern and the order of this going up and down with the one alternative here between either using the first and second valve or just the third valve by itself. And then what we're going to do is examine the open horn again, and then we're going to see what happens when I put my lips at this position, let's say. How can I use this microchromatic scale to move myself down to the next open lip position? And then what happens if I want to do it between the F and the D here, or the number 5 and the number 3 here? What's the distance between these? And what if I want to do it from here down? I can apply this same micro pattern to each lip position, and this is where the overlaps happen. As we get up here higher, you will see the intervals between these notes are closer together, so we don't need to use the whole pattern in order to get fingerings for the notes in between, which allows us to have overlap. So if there's 5 fingering patterns here, and then this thing there's 5 fingering patterns here, and then this thing has some fingering patterns and they overlap like this, then there'll be 2 fingering patterns that are in common between this note and, say, the open note. And the note below it, and with some bell pattern, and what could happen on the open horn with some bell pattern. So let's examine it from that point of view. First of all, we have this micro chromatic scale. With the 7 lip positions, I can pick any position here, taking that note, which is B flat 3, just below middle C, and playing on the open horn. Then if I want to go down a half a step, according to this, I would go to my second valve. So I can go. Then I can go by going to the second valve and then the first fret. Now to get down to that note, the G, I have to use second, first, and then the third valve. Now a lot of trumpeters don't use this, and it's a finger convenience, which I'll show you a little bit later on, but hey, it's really important to understand this. So da da da, and now we're down here at the 3 semitones. Now to go to 4 semitones, 5 semitones, and 6 semitones. So from B flat, I can go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 semitones for the 6 valve patterns by lengthening the horn. So, watch the pattern. And coming back up, so that little pattern gives me a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 note mini little micro chromatic scale. Each of these is a semitone or a chromatic tone or a half step, whichever language you're using. Different language, same. So the chromatic tone, or I like to call it a semitone, 2 semitones, 3, 4, 5, 6 semitones, I can get with the open horn. From this note, I can have 7 notes, which we wrote out in that other chart. Now, I can take my lip and tighten it up 3 times the frequency, up here. And do the same thing coming down. So again, I'm using this micro scale to move with that lip position, using the valves to add the length to bring me down. Now something interesting happens. The distance from here to here is musically a fifth. And it turns out if we look at the number of microtones between, or these microsteps between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's a distance of 7 microsteps, or 7 chromatic tones, or 7 semitones, or 7 half steps, however you want to say that, between those two notes. So let's just put the number 7 there. So from here to here, the distance here is 7 semitones wide. Well, if this is open here, and then I go down a step, and then down a step, and down a step, and down a step, and down a step, and down a step, an interesting thing happens. Right here, where I run out of valves, I'll go from here, ding, 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 5, 6, and then right here, right there, I'll have this valve pattern, and I'll run out of valves. So what happens is I go back to the open tone and then change my lip down to give me this open position again. And I happen to have just enough valves to play every half tone between the F, which is the fifth, down to the root, or the B flat. So between F and B flat, there happen to be 6 tones that I can play with these 6 fingering patterns, and then the 2 open tones then allow me to drop down chromatically, boom, to this lower lip position. So every single half step here, or every single semitone, has a fingering pattern, and that fingering pattern happens to be this micro scale. Also, if I start here on this lowest note, the horn, the B flat, I can go down. Remember? Ding. So I can go down here another half an octave. So from here to here I have 1/2 of an octave. And from here down there I have almost 1/2 of an octave. Or I can play essentially 2 octaves wide with just 2 lip positions. I mean 1 octave wide with just 2 lip positions, and have 6 plus 6, or the 12 chromatic steps, chromatic tones that are necessary to produce all those notes.
Okay.
So what we discovered here was that from the open lip position at the low end of the horn to the next lip position, which is exactly 7 semitones away, we have a lip position here on the 1 open note, which is B flat, and we have a lip position here on the 5th, which is also an open lip position and gives us the note F. And between F, I can go F to E, I can play the flat E, I can play the D below that, I can play the flat D below that I can go to the C, and then I can go down to the B, and at this point I run out of valves. So what happens is I then let go of all the valves, open back up, get the next open lip position, and wind up on B flat. Now, just with these 2 lip positions, which any beginner can do, I can use the micro scale to take this note and go down to B, and then from there go down to to go from B flat down to A, from A down to flat A, from the flat A down to G, from the flat G down to F, and from the flat F down to E. And now you can see from E to E is 12 steps, and from this F to that F is 12 steps, and I actually have a full chromatic octave right there with those two lip positions, and no fingerings repeat. There are no repeating patterns whatsoever. I need all of these valves to get it from here to there, and then from here down to there. Now what happens when I go here? Well, it turns out the distance between here, from here to here, turns out to be only 5 chromatic tones. Here we'll call them semitones. Here they're chromatic tones. I'll use all the terminology. So I only have from this, there, 5 chromatic tones. This is musically a 5th. This is musically a 4th. And what happens is, again, I have an open position here with my lip. And then I can go down from this B flat down to the B, down to the A, from the A to the A flat down to G, the G to G flat, and then all of a sudden wind up right here with F, instead of being played open, being played with some valves, and the E below that being played with some valves. In other words, at that point there'll be a crossover. So if I go right there, that valve pattern is the same as coming down to that valve pattern, only 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I wind up with this open tone and that tone having and then I can go one more half step below that and then wind up having the same valve pattern as E, F, to E, F, to E. So now we have an overlap because the notes have gotten closer together. And what do we have here? We have coming down 5 leaves us from the 7 2 overlaps. The F here can be played open or with the 1 and 3, and the E below that F can be played either with the with the second valve, bringing this open tone down, or with the first, second, and third valve, bringing this open tone down, giving me 2 alternatives right out the gate. Right out the gate. Now let's follow this pattern on. The distance from here to here now is what we call a major third. And a major third has 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. 4, and now I'm going to call them half steps. Semitones, chromatic tones, half steps. Same language. Okay? Science doesn't care what you call it. It's this that's happening. So this is now what we call a major third. I'll write it as a 3RD, major third. And it has 4 chromatic tones. So if I take this D right here, play it open, and then go from the D down, I can go down to C sharp with that valve, second valve. With the first valve, I can go down from the C sharp to the C. With the third valve, or the 1 and 2 valve, I can go from there down to B. And from there, I can go from this next valve right here, wind up right back down onto flat B. Now what happens is this B flat, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 tunings down, is only using 4 out of the possible 7. So we're having some overlap here now. So now whatever this open tone was, B flat, I have a fingering here that will work for it, which this time happens to be 2 and 3. I can then go from B flat down to A, and the A can be played open with the second valve going down one chromatic tone, or I can be playing this, lipping this position and pulling it all the way down here with my first and third valve. So again, these guys would have alternate fingerings. Alternate fingerings, alternate fingerings. Then if I go down from there to flat A, what happens is, now this winds up being the next fingering, 1, 2, 3, and from this tone, all I have to do is go down a whole valve, to valve number 1, which is 2 chromatic tones, and wind up getting the exact same flat A. So now I have here 3 tones. Here we had 2 overlaps. Right here I wind up with 3 overlapping tones. Now let's quickly go on. The distance between here and here is a minor third, which happens to be 3 chromatic tones. And we call this 3M.
Ding.
And what happens is, from here to here now, I have an open tone. I go down to the second fingering, I go down to the first, I go down to the third, and then all of a sudden I wind up on this open tone. So when I get to this fingering pattern right here, I wind up producing this tone. So now I wind up, instead of having 3, I wind up with 4 overlapping patterns in which there are 2 possibilities for the notes. If I go from here to here, it's also a minor third to go from the 5 to the flat 7. So again, there's only a distance of 3 half steps here. So the same thing happens. I go down 3 half steps, and as soon as I get down here to these valves, I've got overlaps. I've got 4 notes that overlap. And now here's the most radical. This open tone, and then I just go to the second valve, and then what happens is on the first valve, I wind up playing the same note here that could also be played open. So this A flat down has 5. Let's see, we only need 2 here. So now there are 5 possible fingerings. And it turns out that when this overlaps, this can come down and start to overlap here. When this comes down, it can sometimes start to overlap in here. So what happens is you get a double overlap as we're getting high. And the higher up the horn we go, the closer they get, the fewer valves I need to produce this microchromatic scale, and the more I'm running into other notes that could be played open, or could be played in a lip position with the second valve as well.
Okay.
Now next week when the students come and we make more of these little segments, I'm going to start them off with how to make up your own fingering pattern. Let's say I'm starting on a note that I'm using the first and second valve on. I don't need to know what that note is. If I want to learn to play by interval rather than to play by ABC, all I have to know is that I need to get to the next position. I need to go just only the second valve, or 1 chromatic tone. So what I need to do is replace this positions 1 and 2, which are 3 semitones, with the third finger, and then add my second finger, which adds 1 piece of tubing. Now we've gone from 3 to 4 semitones, and I've accomplished that goal. If I wanted to go up a whole step, let's say, or go down a whole step, I wanted to go to a note that was a whole tone below that, I would replace these 2 with 3, and then push down the first valve, which is 2 semitones. So I have my 3 semitones plus 2 is 5, and I'm going to go from this position to the next position a whole step below. And by planning or working out what the semitones or half steps and what the whole tones or whole steps are, I can work out a scale or any kind of scaletic pattern that I want from any position. So if I'm holding the second valve, I can look at it and figure out a fingering pattern. If I'm holding the second and third valve, I can work out a fingering pattern. Now, one thing that really helps is to work the 1, 3, and 5, that major chord. And one thing you have to do when you're warming up on trumpet is you have to learn to play arpeggios, or to play open chords. And since we have here in the Overtones series 1, 5, 1, 3, 5, and then a high 1, we'll forget about the 7 flat for the moment. We have this already. What we really need to do is figure out a way to have this sub-octave appear. We have a 1, 3, 5 nicely done here with a major third to a minor third or a perfect fifth here, and that's working just great because that's in the open horn. But is there a way that I can produce the number 3 here that doesn't naturally want to be produced? And it turns out I can use valves, right? The distance from the 5 down to the 3, or from this 5 down to that 3, as we learned earlier, was 4 semitones, or 4 chromatic tones, or 4 semitones, or 4 half steps. So it turns out if I'm playing this open, I go down 1, go down 2, go down 3 semitones, and then all of a sudden, I'm sorry, this is not 4, this is 3. So it's a minor third. 3. Open, I go down 1, 2, 3, and then whatever that fingering pattern is, I just play that fingering pattern, and that note down an octave should appear. So if this is open, then I go to the second valve, would be the next step down. The first valve would be the next step down, and I could either have valves 1 and 2 or valve 3. So it turns out that if I want to produce the 3 here, musically, that third, all I need to do is use the third finger. That third valve happens to be the 3 steps below that open note that I need to produce the number 3 down here, and I should be able to, with that, produce 1, 3, 5. So if I take my open horn and start here on B flat, nice. And then if I just play the open tone positions, so now with a single valve being added, I can map in that 3 and now play an arpeggio. If I were a good player, I could get all the way up to there and so now I can play 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, and these would all be open, and those would be open, and I'd only need 1 valve for that. So I can play this arpeggio to get my lip in shape, and then after a while, as I develop endurance, finally hit this one up here and play 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3. I can't even sing it. 1, 5, 3, 1, 5, 3, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 5, 3, 1, 5, 3, 1. And that's a good way of warming up your lip and playing an arpeggio, and I'm playing what's called a broken chord. So I'm playing a major chord, a B flat major chord. Now if I hold the second valve down, it turns out that what I'm doing up there I can also do with the second valve. And when I use the second valve, this whole thing comes down a half step. So now here, this is A, this becomes E, and this is A, and we have the D flat here,
C sharp,
which is a C sharp, and we have the F coming down to E, and now we can play the same thing, but if I want to get this C sharp here down here, all I need to do is to the second valve add the third valve. Just kick it. So if I put the third valve here down while I'm holding this valve, what should pop up right here is the C sharp that's missing from the pattern. So now I can go, starting here on A, ta-da. What if I go on and I go to the next one? Well, this pattern down here, which brings me down to A flat, is with the first valve. So if I'm holding the first valve, and then right here at this point, kick in the third valve, so I have the third and the first valve held down here, then that note, A flat, so the C here, will kick in. And this flat E, these guys will still be open tones, where these will be open tones, and I just have to use the third valve to assist getting that valve on there. So again, I can start here on A flat and play A flat arpeggios, kicking that in. See, I can play a little better there. Because we're lower down on the horn, and I can kick it up to here. Well, I could continue this down, going down through all of the chromatic, the microchromatic scale, adding in this valve, and then something happens. Let's see what happens. If I get over here now, 2, 1, and now I'm adding in the third valve, or playing in its alternate 1 and 2. Remember, I can put 1 plus 2. And then hold 1 plus 2 to get my G down here, my G scale. And then my D here and my G, these can be done by holding the valves 1 and 2, which are equivalent to that, and then still using the 3 here to kick in. So I can do this. I can hold these 2 valves down and get my G. Now what happens when I need to use this valve and that valve to get the next line? I can't kick in this third valve anymore. Well, it turns out that when we go down, I'm going to do it up here. When we go down one more line, did you beep?
20 seconds.
20 seconds? Next segment.
Rolling.
So now to pick up where we left off in the last segment, I was saying what happens here when suddenly I need the third valve. Well, I can use valves 1 and 2 to replace that. So I could play an arpeggio by holding down the third valve, and when I need to get to the third here, I can kick in 1 and 2 and then play on that open valve. Or I can play with 1 and 2 and then kick it in there, and 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. Use those in combinations. So I have that alternate. But what happens when we go to the next step? Where in the next step, I'm using valve 3 for my 3 half steps, and valve 2 for my 1 half steps, so I have an offset now of 4. Well, a strange thing happens. If I am playing the note here, flat G, and then going here to flat D, and then here again flat D, G, watch what happens to fill in there. Since I'm adding these little this third valve, what happens if I suddenly remove the valves? So if I'm doing this, now it turns out that third kicks in on the open horn, because it's really one of the notes down here. It's one of these notes down here. So what happens is, to get the note in between here, let's see, what's after G flat is B flat here for my third. And then I've got D.
Flat?
No, G flat, yeah. D. So here's my 1, 3, and 5, G flat, B flat, and D flat. So I need to create here a B flat. Well, you'll notice that B flat happens to be the open tuning of the horn and requires zero valves. So what I simply do is open that up and make that 0 valves. From now I've got my arpeggios that I can play with by just adding in, taking off everything. Now what do you think is going to happen when I go from 1 and 2 now, and I'm going to move over and I'm going to need, let me erase something here. I'm going to need to take it now and hold down valve number 3, which gives me 3 half steps, and valve number 1, which is giving me 5 half steps. Well, here's what happens. The root, the third, the fifth, the root, the third, the fifth. If I'm holding down here for here, here, there, and even up here now, those are all going to be whatever valves I'm holding, which in this case is the third valve plus the first valve, which equals 5 half steps. It turns out that in the one pattern before I needed this to be open. What if I use the second valve here? Then I'm flatting this position by 1 half step. So if I just, while I'm holding these, kick in the second valve here, so for a brief moment I have valves 1, 2, and 3, that will produce that third that I need. And now I can play the arpeggios, and again now we're going down to F. Just as up here I did, down here I can go. I'm sorry, I just need the second valve by itself. And now what if I do that valve down? Well, the next place would be one more half step down, so I could replace this valve, the 2, with the first valve, which I know is 2 semitones down. So now I can go, when I'm playing an E, just played arpeggios off of every valve pattern by only adding one more valve pattern alternative right here. And in each case I was using the logic of adding until I ran out of valves. And when I ran out of valves here on valves 2 and 3, then it was open. And then when I went to valves 1 and 3 here, this was the second valve. And when I went to valves 1, 2, and 3, then this was the first valve. So the logic is that that micro scale is actually a circle, going around and around and around. I'm going down, 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 reset. Down, 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 reset. Down, 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 reset. And by changing just this one valve pattern, here I can play open arpeggios on every valve, and again, teach myself to have the flexibility that I need, and also to play those major chords like zippity, zippity, do-da-do. And that's it for this part. Next week, I will be showing how to take any fingering anywhere, not knowing what the note is, and then how to use this idea of the arpeggio to then fill in, to fill in, to fill in. We know the distance from here to here now is a major third, and we know that we had to use a fingering here with 3 and 1. I had to put the number 2 here. So what do I have to do to fill it in from here to here, starting with this as 2? I have to go to the next thing in the pattern, which will be, in this case, a 1, and then a 3, and then so on and so forth. And what happens when I have to fill in from here down there, 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 etc. We'll be using that micro scale to fill out these patterns, and we'll be starting with something like G or something like that, and then we'll figure out a number of what we call whole steps and half steps, or I like to say a whole tone or a semitone, whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone. And we will make up things like major scales, patterns, minor scale patterns, or if you want to do the Gypsy Byzantine harmonic minor, you can just figure out a number code for that, figure out how many half steps are going to be from these open positions to the notes that you want, and then figure out what fingers you need to get there. Till next time, Mr. Natural out. Please go to YouTube, Ubernatch, to get more of the skinny, and we will be building up the website. You should be on website YouTube Music by Interval, or YouTube / Music the Natural Way. And on those websites I'll be fleshing out more and more of these lessons. When we get to the woodwinds, we'll be showing how to use foreshortening to create these fingering patterns, and then on strings we'll learn how to use shortening to go up and lengthening to go down, and how the offsets of multiple strings work on various types of stringed instruments, and of course how these scale things and these semitone patterns work on the keyboards and any other musical instrument that's out there. Thank you.